Many called it the most chaotic climate summit in 30 years. Burst sewage, scarce food and water, officials with nothing left. But at 7 a.m. in Egypt, nearly 2 days late, the tired search for a deal at least ended.
I now declare the conference closed.
The tepid applause, a stark contrast to the jubilation of Paris in 2015. But in Egypt, a breakthrough at last for those on the devastated front line of the climate crisis, who heralded a newly agreed fund for their loss and damage after decades of asking.
We have struggled for 30 years on this path, and today in Sharm el-Sheikh, this journey has achieved its first positive milestone. The establishment of a fund is not about dispensing charity. It is clearly a down payment on the longer investment in our joint futures.
Historic, yes, but for now it's agreement on just the existence of a fund, an emergency bank account for climate disasters, but with a bank balance of zero. The battle now will be over who pays into it and who can take money out. The havoc wrought by this year's floods in Pakistan alone are thought to be $30 billion. Filling a new fund to meet that will be no small task, as even the richest countries languish through a cost of living crisis. And as delegates filed out in Egypt, many were left exasperated, as they lamented how progress on finance had come at the expense of progress on dealing with the very cause of the climate crisis, emissions reductions and weaning the world off fossil fuels. No tears from Alex Sharma this time, only frustration.
Emissions peaking before 2025, as the science tells us, is necessary. Not in this text. Clear follow-through on the phase-down of coal. Not in this text. A clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels. Not in this text. And the energy text weakened in the final minutes.
Some wording in the deal is seen as too weak. Low emissions energy, unabated coal, less prominence given to the climate goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, all seen as leaving the door open to fossil fuels. 636 lobbyists with links to the fossil fuel industry were at this summit. The only larger national delegation was from the oil-rich United Arab Emirates, hosts of COP28 next year, who sent over 1,000 representatives. On the sidelines of talks on climate action, at least a dozen new gas deals have been struck.
We deliver gas to Europe because Europe is needing this gas.
An issue not lost on activists this week, who challenged the very presence of oil and gas bosses at a climate summit. In Egypt, those desperate for help now with the rising tide at their door return home a little more assured, while those hoping to limit the rise of that tide in the first place leave afraid for what's to come.
And Simon's here with us in the studio now. Simon, just sum up the significance of COP27 for us now.
Well, it's actually quite difficult to overestimate the significance of this shift we've seen because, look, these summits have been going on for 30 years. Up until now, almost all the priority and focus has been on reducing emissions to lessen the severity of climate change in the future. Now, that's always been a big problem for poor countries who say that A, we don't have the resources to reshape our energy systems like we have here, and B, talking about lessening climate change in the future is fine for you, rich country in the global north, but for us, climate change is already here. So this agreement on a fund for climate impacts is a kind of rebalancing of priorities and of focus. Some will say even a rebalancing of power over who gets what in these talks. Because the really striking thing today was that for the first time, you had small, poor countries leaving, feeling cautiously optimistic, and it was the rich countries who actually left feeling quite dejected, the UK, the EU, and the US. So it's for that reason alone that we may see this as a real watershed moment.
Simon, thanks very much. Well, joining me now from Massachusetts is Rachel Kite, Dean of Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a former United Nations Climate Special Representative. Rachel Kite, on the one hand, just picking up where Simon left off there, we've had this loss and damage fund established, and yet the oil-producing countries got what they wanted out of COP27. So was this a good COP or a bad COP?
Well, a bit of both. You can't underestimate, as Simon said, the significance of the agreement to establish the fund. What kind of money flows into it, from whom, and then who can draw down on it in what ways is to be negotiated over the next 2 years. But yes, the fossil fuel industry and petrostates showed their strength towards the end of the talks. And we had this sort of absurdist discussion about whether oil and gas caused the problem or whether it's emissions that cause the problem. You know, living here in the United States, it sounds like guns. You know, do guns cause the problem, or is it people using guns? At the end of the day, we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels very, very quickly. We have to peak by the middle of the decade. And if the oil and gas industry wants to be involved in that, then they're going to have to pay, or somebody's going to have to pay for the capturing and the storing of all of the emissions that come with the use of fossil fuels. It's going to be much cheaper, much quicker to install much more renewable energy. But of course, finance isn't on the table sufficiently. And so the developing world is saying, look, where's the money for this huge upswing in investment in renewable energy that we need?
But given there's no mention of phasing out fossil fuels, that target's not there, does it mean that that 1.5 Celsius target, the warming target, is now for the birds?
Well, 1.5 as the goal, as the target, doesn't change. That's the scientific goal and target. What's up for grabs now is whether we get to the target sort of from the front door, from the back door. Do we get there by curbing emissions quickly enough that we don't get to 1.5, or do we overshoot 1.5 and then effectively limit emissions in later years and then sort of get back down to 1.5? So that's called overshoot. I think the dilemma is that we need to keep pushing forward to this goal. It means urgent action. It's going to be much more expensive to reach 1.5 from an overshoot position. And also, we don't know what kind of tipping points we're hitting up against nature every time we go over 1.5. So 1.5 is still the target.
But when you talk about overshoot, that sounds almost kind of like quite a polite way of talking about it. It's a catastrophe if it goes beyond 1.5, isn't it? And therefore, is it a watershed, as Simon was saying, that we've now got to the point where we're talking about paying for the damage that is already upon us?
Yeah, we've done far too little for far too long. We find ourselves now at this point of critical inflection where we just have to reduce emissions really, really quickly. It'd be much more expensive to do other things like capturing emissions in the atmosphere and geoengineering, all of the sort of techno-optimistic things that you hear. And yes, we've already seen $250 billion of insured losses this year. The number's only going to go up. And the human toll and the toll on livestock, for example, just a few hundred miles south of Sharm el-Sheikh is there for us to see. So while people want to talk about the technological fixes for this, we've got people in real danger in developing countries, but also the vulnerable in our own communities.
And there's a sort of, it's very striking, isn't it, that we have these COPs and there's disappointment and there's rage and despair almost. So has COP itself outlived its usefulness, do you think?
Well, it's the village square. It's the only place in the world where every country gets the same vote, whether you're Vanuatu or Tuvalu or the United States or Saudi Arabia. And that's critically important. And without that, we would never have got agreement on loss and damage, because you had 140 developing countries sticking together and pushing and pushing and pushing, with charismatic women, I have to say, in the leadership, from Mia Motley to Sherry Raymond from Pakistan. So, and then you've got like a sort of trade fair that happens around it, where you see all kinds of deals getting done. And no matter the 600 and whatever it was, gas and oil lobbyists, most of the deals done were on renewable energy, on new technology. Right. So it's a bit unwieldy, but I think it plays its role.
Rachel Kite, thanks very much. Always all for charismatic women.